A biased and racist teacher. A classroom full of tension. But there's a twist that no one saw coming, and it's about to expose years of hidden prejudice. Get ready for a story that will make you rethink what really goes on behind closed classroom doors. The bell rang, signaling the start of another day at Westfield High. Ms. Barrett stood at the front of her English class, her stern gaze sweeping over the students as they settled into their seats. The air felt thick with unease, a familiar tension that always seemed to accompany her lessons. As the last few stragglers hurried in, a new face appeared in the doorway. Lena Carter stepped into the room, her backpack slung over one shoulder. The other students' eyes followed her, some curious, others wary. Ms. Barrett's lips tightened into a thin line as she watched Lena make her way to an empty desk. Well, Ms. Barrett said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. It seems we have a new addition to our class. I do hope you can keep up with our rigorous curriculum. The way she emphasized rigorous made it clear she had her doubts. Lena met her gaze steadily but said nothing. As Ms. Barrett turned back to the board, the atmosphere in the room shifted, a storm brewing just beneath the surface. The tension in the classroom was palpable. What happens when a teacher's prejudice collides with a student's quiet strength? Lena's next move could change everything. Ms. Barrett cleared her throat, her eyes narrowing as they settled on Lena. Today we'll be discussing the themes of power and oppression in To Kill a Mockingbird. Who would like to start? Her gaze swept the room, deliberately avoiding Lena's raised hand. After calling on several other students, Ms. Barrett finally acknowledged Lena with a tight smile. Yes, Lena, do you have something to contribute? Lena straightened in her seat, her voice steady. I believe the novel shows how systemic racism. Systemic racism? Ms. Barrett interrupted, her tone dripping with condescension. My dear, I think you're confusing this classic American novel with some modern political agenda. A ripple of unease passed through the classroom. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others smirked, eagerly anticipating the drama unfolding before them. Lena took a deep breath, her fingers curling around the edge of her desk. With all due respect, Ms. Barrett, the racial injustice in the book is a reflection of... That's quite enough. Ms. Barrett cut her off, waving a dismissive hand. Perhaps you should focus on understanding the text as it's written, rather than trying to impose your own interpretations. The air in the room grew thick with tension. Lena's jaw clenched, her eyes never leaving Ms. Barrett's face. She remained silent, but her posture spoke volumes, a quiet defiance that seemed to unsettle the teacher even more. Ms. Barrett turned back to the whiteboard, her marker squeaking as she wrote. Now let's discuss the actual themes the author intended. Can anyone tell me about the symbolism of the mockingbird? As the lesson continued, Ms. Barrett pointedly ignored Lena's attempts to participate. Every time Lena raised her hand, the teacher's gaze would slide past her, as if she were invisible. The message was clear: Lena's voice was not welcome in this classroom. Other students began to take notice. A few exchanged worried glances, their discomfort growing with each passing minute. Others, however, seemed to feed off the teacher's behavior, throwing sidelong smirks in Lena's direction. Lena's frustration was evident in the set of her shoulders and the tightness around her eyes. Yet she remained composed, her pen moving steadily across her notebook as she took meticulous notes. It was a small act of resistance, a refusal to be silenced or pushed out of her education. As the class neared its end, Ms. Barrett announced a group project. I'll be assigning the groups. We wouldn't want anyone to feel out of place. The implications of her words hung heavy in the air. Lena's eyes narrowed slightly, recognizing the challenge for what it was. She squared her shoulders, meeting Ms. Barrett's gaze with quiet determination. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, students began to file out. Lena took her time gathering her things, her movements deliberate and unhurried. Just as she reached the door, Ms. Barrett called out, "Lena, a word." Lena turned, her expression carefully neutral. "Yes, Ms. Barrett?" The teacher's smile was thin and sharp. "I hope you understand that in this class, We focus on facts and analysis, not personal opinions or agendas. I'd hate to see you struggle because you can't separate your feelings from the curriculum." For a moment, Lena said nothing. Then, with a calm that belied the storm brewing inside her, she replied, "I understand perfectly, Ms. Barrett. I look forward to demonstrating my analysis skills in our next discussion." With that, she turned and walked out, leaving Ms. Barrett staring after her, a flicker of uncertainty crossing the teacher's face. As the days passed, Ms. Barrett's initial uncertainty hardened into cold resolve. She'd show that girl exactly who was in charge, no matter the cost. The next class would reveal the depths of her prejudice and test Lena's strength like never before. Lena stood at the front of the classroom, determined to prove herself despite Ms. Barrett's constant belittling. The project board behind her displayed a meticulously researched analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird, focusing on the themes of racial injustice and moral courage. As Lena began her presentation, Ms. Barrett's eyes narrowed, her lips curling into a smirk. She watched like a predator waiting to pounce, her pen tapping impatiently against her grading sheet. The other students shifted uneasily in their seats, sensing the tension in the air. Halfway through her presentation, Lena paused to answer questions. Ms. Barrett's hand shot up immediately. "Lena," she drawled, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "I'm curious about your choice of focus. Don't you think you're overemphasizing certain aspects of the novel?" Lena's brow furrowed slightly, but her voice remained steady. "I believe the racial themes are central to understanding the book's message," Harper Lee herself said. "I'm well aware of what the author said," Ms. Barrett interrupted, her tone sharp. "But I'm more interested in why you seem unable to appreciate the broader literary merits beyond your personal biases." A collective gasp rippled through the classroom. Lena's hands clenched at her sides, her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. "I don't believe my analysis is biased, Ms. Barrett. I've supported each point with textual evidence and scholarly sources." Ms. Barrett stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She strode to the front of the room, positioning herself between Lena and the rest of the class. "Let me make something clear, Lena. This constant focus on race is not only misguided but also disruptive to the learning environment. Perhaps in your previous school, such narrow interpretations were acceptable, but here, we expect a higher level of academic rigor." The silence in the room was deafening. Some students stared at their desks, unable to meet Lena's eyes. Others watched with a mix of horror and morbid fascination as their teacher continued her tirade. Furthermore, Ms. Barrett pressed on, her voice rising, "Your insistence on inserting modern political agendas into classic literature is not only inappropriate but also demonstrates a fundamental lack of understanding. I'm beginning to wonder if you're truly capable of handling the curriculum at this level." Lena's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she refused to back down. "Ms. Barrett, I respectfully disagree. The themes of racial injustice in To Kill a Mockingbird are as relevant today as they were when the book was written. Ignoring them does a disservice to the author's intent." "Enough," Ms. Barrett snapped. "Your attitude is bordering on insubordination. I suggest you take your seat and reflect on whether you're truly prepared for the academic standards of this class." As Lena slowly gathered her materials, the weight of the humiliation pressing down on her shoulders, a small voice piped up from the back of the room. "But I thought Lena's presentation was really good." Ms. Barrett whirled around, her eyes flashing. "And what would you know about literary analysis, Mr. Peterson? Perhaps you'd like to join Lena in detention to discuss your own academic shortcomings." The student shrank back in his seat, effectively silenced. Ms. Barrett turned back to Lena, who stood frozen by her desk. "Well, what are you waiting for? Sit down so we can move on to presentations actually worth our time." Lena sank into her chair, her face burning with a mixture of anger and shame. She could feel the eyes of her classmates on her, some sympathetic, others cruelly amused. The injustice of it all threatened to overwhelm her, but she forced herself to take slow, steady breaths. As Ms. Barrett called the next student to present, Lena's mind raced. She knew she couldn't let this continue, but what could she do? The teacher held all the power, and speaking out would only lead to more humiliation. For now, she would have to endure, but a quiet determination began to build within her. This wasn't over. As Lena sat in her seat, her mind racing with thoughts of justice and retribution, fate was about to deal an unexpected hand. The classroom door opened, and Ms. Barrett looked up, a smug smile playing on her lips. Ms. Barrett launched into her complaints, her voice growing more animated with each passing moment. Well, for starters, Lena consistently challenges the curriculum. She insists on injecting her personal views into every discussion, derailing the lessons I've carefully prepared. As she spoke, Mr. Harris's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. He remained silent, allowing Ms. Barrett to continue her tirade. And her attitude! Ms. Barrett exclaimed, throwing her hands up in exasperation. She's constantly disrupting the class with her unique perspectives. Just today, she gave a presentation that completely missed the point of To Kill a Mockingbird, focusing solely on racial themes and ignoring the broader literary merits. Mr. Harris raised an eyebrow. And you believe this focus on racial themes is inappropriate for discussing a novel that centers around a charged trial? Ms. Barrett faltered for a moment, caught off guard by the question. Well, I believe we should focus on the universal themes, not get bogged down in specific issues. I see, Mr. Harris said, his tone measured. And how exactly has Lena been disruptive? Can you give me specific examples? Ms. Barrett straightened, regaining her confidence. Of course. She constantly raises her hand to challenge points I make in class. She argues with other students during discussions, and her body language, the way she sits there, all defiant, it's clear she has no respect for authority. As Ms. Barrett spoke, Mr. Harris's expression shifted subtly. A hint of steel entered his eyes, though his voice remained calm. Ms. Barrett, I'd like to ask you something. Have you considered that what you perceive as defiance might actually be a student engaged in critical thinking? Ms. Barrett blinked, taken aback by the question. I suppose I hadn't thought of it that way. But Mr. Harris, you have to understand, this girl is simply not a good fit for our school. Her previous education must have been lacking. Perhaps a different environment would be more suitable for her. Mr. Harris's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I see. And what makes you think Lena's previous education was lacking? Well, it's obvious, isn't it? Ms. Barrett said, her voice dripping with condescension. The way she speaks, her focus on certain issues, it's clear she hasn't been exposed to the level of rigor we expect here. Mr. Harris took a deep breath, his calm demeanor masking the storm brewing beneath the surface. Ms. Barrett, I think it's time I clarified something for you. Lena's previous education was excellent. In fact, I can personally vouch for that. Ms. Barrett frowned, confusion evident on her face. I don't understand. How could you possibly know that? Mr. Harris's eyes locked onto Ms. Barrett, his gaze unwavering. I know because I'm Lena's father. The color drained from Ms. Barrett's face as the implications of Mr. Harris's words sank in. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. The smug confidence that had carried her through the conversation evaporated in an instant. You're... Ms. Barrett stammered, her eyes wide with shock and growing horror. Mr. Harris nodded, his expression grave. Yes, Ms. Barrett. Lena Harris is my daughter, and I've been listening very carefully to everything you said about her. Ms. Barrett stumbled backward, her hand gripping the edge of a nearby desk for support. The realization of what she had done, of the prejudices she had revealed to the school's principal, and more importantly, to a father, crashed over her like a tidal wave. Mr. Harris, I had no idea. She managed to choke out, her voice barely above a whisper. Clearly, Mr. Harris replied, his tone carrying a weight that made Ms. Barrett flinch. But ignorance is no excuse for the behavior you've displayed. Not only have you demonstrated a clear bias against my daughter, but your comments suggest a pattern of discrimination that goes beyond a single student. Ms. Barrett's mind raced, desperately searching for a way to salvage the situation. Mr. Harris, please. I can explain. I never meant to. Mr. Harris held up a hand, silencing her. I think you've explained quite enough, Ms. Barrett. We'll be having a much longer conversation about this. But for now, I suggest you return to your classroom. We wouldn't want to keep the students waiting, would we? As Ms. Barrett numbly nodded and turned to leave, Mr. Harris added, Oh, and Ms. Barrett? I'll be sitting in on your class for the remainder of the day. I'm very interested in observing your teaching methods firsthand. Mr. Harris's measured tone belied the storm brewing beneath as he stepped back into the classroom, followed by a visibly shaken Ms. Barrett. The atmosphere shifted palpably. Students straightened in their seats, sensing the tension crackling between the two adults. Class, Mr. Harris addressed the room, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of steel. I believe we need to have an important discussion about respect, diversity, and the true purpose of education. Ms. Barrett stood rigidly by her desk, her earlier confidence evaporated. She glanced nervously at Mr. Harris, then at Lena, her mind racing to process the revelation she had just experienced. Mr. Harris continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. It has come to my attention that there have been some concerning incidents in this class, incidents that go against everything our school stands for. A collective intake of breath rippled through the students. Some cast furtive glances at Lena, pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Ms. Barrett, Mr. Harris said, turning to the teacher, would you care to explain to the class why you felt it necessary to consistently undermine and belittle one of your students? Ms. Barrett's mouth opened and closed, words failing her. Mr. Harris, I never meant to. Never meant to what, Ms. Barrett? Mr. Harris's voice rose slightly, his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. Never meant to make racist assumptions about a student's background? Never meant to dismiss valid interpretations of literature because they didn't align with your narrow worldview? The students watched in stunned silence as their usually mild-mannered principal transformed before their eyes. His words, precise and cutting, laid bare the injustices that had been simmering beneath the surface of their classroom for weeks. Let me be clear, Mr. Harris continued, his eyes locked on Ms. Barrett. Your behavior towards Lena and I suspect towards other students of color is not only unprofessional but deeply harmful. You've created an environment where students feel unsafe expressing their thoughts and experiences. Ms. Barrett attempted to interject, her voice trembling. Mr. Harris, please. If I could just explain. Explain what, exactly? Mr. Harris cut her off, his patience wearing thin. Explain how you mocked Lena's analysis of To Kill a Mockingbird because it focused on racial themes? Explain how you've consistently ignored her raised hand in class discussions? Or perhaps you'd like to explain your comment about her previous education being lacking simply because she doesn't conform to your preconceived notions. The color drained from Ms. Barrett's face as Mr. Harris recounted her actions. She glanced around the room, seeking any sign of support, but found only shocked and disappointed faces staring back at her. Mr. Harris turned to address the class once more. Students, I want you to understand something. Education is not about silencing voices or dismissing perspectives that challenge our own. It's about expanding our understanding, engaging in respectful dialogue, and learning from diverse experiences. He paused, letting his words sink in. What you've witnessed in this classroom is not education. It's discrimination, plain and simple. And it stops today. The tension in the room was palpable. Some students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in agreement with Mr. Harris's words. Lena sat quietly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears of relief and vindication. Mr. Harris's gaze returned to Ms. Barrett, who seemed to shrink under his scrutiny. Ms. Barrett, your actions have demonstrated a clear pattern of discrimination that goes beyond a single student. This behavior is unacceptable and will be addressed through the proper channels. For now, I'll be taking over your class for the remainder of the day. As Ms. Barrett gathered her things, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, the reality of the situation seemed to finally hit her. She cast one last desperate look around the classroom before hurrying out the door. The silence that followed her exit was deafening. Mr. Harris took a deep breath, visibly calming himself before addressing the class once more. "I apologize that you've had to," Mr. Harris continued, his voice steady but full of purpose. "I know this has been an intense and emotional experience for all of you, but I believe it's important for you to understand that prejudice and discrimination have no place in our school or in our society." He moved to the front of the classroom, his posture relaxing slightly. Some students looked shell-shocked, others relieved. A few cast apologetic glances towards Lena, the weight of their silent complicity hanging heavy in the air. Mr. Harris cleared his throat, regaining the class's attention. "We'll be bringing in a counselor to help process what's happened here. For now, class is dismissed early. Please use this time to reflect on what you've witnessed and how we can all work together to create a more inclusive environment." As the students filed out, many paused to offer words of support to Lena. Sarah, who had always sat quietly in the front row, approached hesitantly. "I'm sorry I never spoke up," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew what was happening wasn't right, but I was scared. It won't happen again." Lena nodded, a small smile of understanding on her face. "Thank you, Sarah. Speaking up is hard, but it's how we make things better." Outside the classroom, word spread quickly. Students gathered in small groups, discussing what they'd heard in hushed tones. As Lena emerged, flanked by her father, a hush fell over the hallway. Then, slowly, a ripple of applause began. It started with just a few students and then grew, echoing through the corridor. Lena walked tall, her head held high. The fear and isolation she'd felt for weeks melted away, replaced by a sense of empowerment. Her classmates weren't just seeing her now, they were truly recognizing her strength and resilience. Meanwhile, in the administrative office, Ms. Barrett faced the consequences of her actions. The school board convened for an emergency meeting, and within hours, a decision was reached. As the final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Ms. Barrett was escorted from the building by security, a cardboard box of personal items clutched to her chest. Students watched from windows and doorways as their former teacher walked to her car, her career in education effectively over. There was no satisfaction in the scene, only a somber recognition that actions have consequences. The next morning, as Lena approached the school, she noticed a change in the atmosphere. Students who had previously avoided her now offered friendly smiles and waves in the hallways. She overheard snippets of conversations about diversity workshops and plans for a cultural awareness club. As she entered her English classroom, now temporarily led by a substitute teacher, Lena was greeted by a sea of supportive faces. The tension that had permeated the room for weeks was gone, replaced by an air of openness and mutual respect. During lunch, Lena found herself surrounded by classmates eager to hear her thoughts on how to make the school more inclusive. Ideas flowed freely, from diversifying the curriculum to establishing mentorship programs for minority students. For the first time, Lena felt truly heard and valued. After school, as Lena walked out with her father, they passed by Ms. Barrett's now empty parking spot. Mr. Harris squeezed his daughter's shoulder gently. "You know, Lena, what happened here isn't just about one teacher or one classroom. It's a reminder that change is possible, but it takes courage to speak up and stand firm in the face of injustice." Lena nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I just hope it makes a difference beyond today. There are so many others who face discrimination every day, in and out of school." The events at Westfield High exposed how prejudice can lurk even in educational settings. Ms. Barrett's treatment of Lena revealed deep-seated biases that had gone unchecked for years. But Lena's courage in speaking up sparked a transformation. The school community rallied around creating a more inclusive environment. New initiatives, diversity training, and open dialogues challenged long-held assumptions. Students and teachers alike were forced to confront their own biases and blind spots. Lena's journey from victim to leader showed the power of resilience in the face of injustice. Her willingness to turn pain into positive change inspired others to examine their own beliefs and actions.